In the last episode, we learned about encoding text so we could display special characters inside of a web page without our code thinking that it's supposed to be HTML. In this episode, we're going to have a lot of fun. We are going to add our first truly interactive experience to this page by adding a text input box where we can type in new tasks and have them add to our list. So let's jump right in. First, I'm going to do just a little code cleanup here. I want to remove our console.log statements from the last time. And just to reorder some things, I'm going to cut and paste this li function to right above our HTML string. Now we have our tasks variable up at the top. We have our li function, our HTML variable, and then the code that will insert that HTML into our empty div element. Now, let's add a text input. So in our HTML file, below our empty div, our empty screen div, let's add another HTML tag, another new HTML tag. This one is called input. So I'm going to do input, and input, if I did this, input doesn't actually have any what's called children. It doesn't have anything that would go inside of this tag. So rather than have a separate opening and closing tag, instead we're just going to have one tag, and we're going to put a space / at the end to signify that this is an open and closing all in one. So if I save this and refresh my page, now we have a text input on the screen where we can type some text. We can't do anything with this yet, but at least we have that there. Let's add one more item to our screen, and that is a button. We want something we can click to say add task. And we can add a button with the button tag. So I'm going to say button. Now inside the button tag is how we specify what that button is labeled as. So let's call it add task. I'll save and refresh. Now we have this text input and our add task button. Of course, nothing happens yet because we haven't defined any behavior for this button. So let me explain what we want to do overall. What we want to do is we want to be able to type some text in here, blah, 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 click add task. Then we want to use some JavaScript to detect when we click add task. That JavaScript would need to find this text input element, take whatever this value of this inputted text is, and we want to add it to this list. So how might we add it to this list? We could figure out a way to go insert a fifth li tag here in this list. But what we're going to do is we have this tasks array up here, and I want to append whatever we entered here to this tasks array and then kind of replace what we have in this list. So we're going to walk through all of this step by step. So first things first, we need something that will detect this button click, because that's when we want to take action and add this item. In order to do that, like this line of code here where we are getting an element and assigning it to this variable, we need to get a reference to this button so that we can attach functionality to detecting clicks. So up here in my HTML, just like on our div tag, we added an ID attribute and called it screen. Let's do the same thing for button. So let's add an ID attribute to the button. And I'm going to call this add-task-button. Just going to abbreviate button. Then in my JavaScript code, I'm going to assign a variable called button to a document dot get element by ID, and then using the same ID I have up here. So add, I'm gonna make a string, add task btn. There, now we have a button element assigned to this variable. Now we can do things with that button. So on this button, there is a property called onClick. And onClick is a property that we can set to do something on a click. So we're going to set this property equal to a function. Just like all of our other functions, we're going to have parentheses for inputs, our fat arrow, and then in our case, we are going to have multiple lines here. So I'm going to use our opening and curly braces so that we can have multiple lines within this function. So I'll do parentheses, our fat arrow, and our curly braces to start off this function. Okay, so this function will be automatically called by our page since we're setting it to button.onClick every time this button receives a click. So boom, that would call the function, boom, that would call the function, boom, that would call the function. Every time I click it, this function gets called. So what do we need to do when this function gets called? We need to find this input and get the text value from it. So very similarly, we need to find this input. How do we find an input on a page? We're going to use get element by ID. So up here, let's once again add an ID to this input element. And we will call this new task label. So down here, once again, I'm going to create a variable called, I'm going to call this label input. By the way, it's convention in JavaScript to always start variables off with a lowercase. And if you want to make it multiple words, to uppercase every word after that. And there are no spaces in variables. So we have lowercase label, uppercase I, input. So I'm going to call this label input. I'm going to do document.get element by ID. And then that ID is the same one I put in the HTML file, new task label. Now I have a reference to this input. So how do we get the text that the user entered? For that, we'll use label input dot value. That will be the string of text that the user entered. Let's set this string equal to a variable. So I'm going to call this just label text. And that will be our label string. Now, we want to take that label string and add it to our tasks array up above. Tasks is an array, and arrays have a function on them called push. Push will push an item or append an item onto the end of that array. So I'm going to push onto this array the label text, which is the label string. Now let me save that. Need to be sure we save both files and refresh my screen. And let me go ahead and add a task here. So first user task, add. Nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? We have our tasks array. We are getting the input, we're getting the text, we're pushing it to the array. Why did nothing happen? Well, how this list is being put into the page is this code right here. We are setting screen.enter HTML set to HTML that we generated above. But that code is only being run the first time this page is loaded. We really need to regenerate this list and re-render it to the page. So anytime we want to do something multiple times, it's good to put it in a function. So I'm going to create a function here, and we're going to call it render. So we'll create a variable called render and create a function. Inputs, fat arrow, curly braces. So I'm going to open my curly braces there, and I'm going to set my closing curly brace down here. Then I'm going to tab these over to signify these are part of the function. So what we want to happen is every time render is called, we want render to take our LIs, or take our tasks, generate LI elements for them, and push those to the screen. So we have our HTML here. You have X number of tasks. We are creating our tasks. We're getting our screen, and we're setting the HTML. So I've created a function here. Let me save this and refresh. Okay, now we have another issue. We don't have anything on the screen. Well, that's because when we create a function, we are only creating the instructions for that function. That function is not run until the function is called. So right after we define this function here, let's go ahead and call it that first time the page loads. So right below it, I'm just going to go ahead and reference render and an open and closed parentheses to call it. So if I save and refresh, now we once again have our tasks on the screen. So now in our button handler, our button onClick function, we're getting the input, we're extracting the text from that input, we're pushing it to the tasks array. Now we want to re-render this list of tasks and push an updated list of tasks to the screen. So all we have to do for that is call our render function again. So every time this button's clicked, we get the input, we get the text, we push it to the array, we call the render function that will generate new HTML. It will get our screen div element, and it will set the inner HTML on that element. If there was already HTML there, it's just going to wipe it away and reset it with new HTML. So let's save and try it out. So I'm going to refresh, and let's say adding our first task. Click. And there we go. We just dynamically added an item to this page. Let's do it again. Adding our second task. Boom. And so you can see that it's generating a new list item each time. It's even updating our number up here. So if I do another task, you'll notice that this number changes because that is being regenerated, re-rendered every time this render function is called, which is both on initial load and on the click of the button. That's pretty exciting, huh? We actually have some interaction on our page now. Now that we have the ability to add tasks, let's polish up the user experience a bit here. Whenever I click this Add Task button, what I'd really like to happen is I would like for it to clear this text that I entered, kind of resetting it for entering in my next task. How we can do that is down here in our onClick function. Remember we used label input.value to get the text value? Well, we can also use label input.value to set the text value. So we can use that to set the text value to nothing or to an empty string to clear it out. So let's call label input.value and set that equal to nothing. Now, how can we do this? We can do this because before we set it equal to nothing, we set that value that it was equal to this label text string. And we've gone ahead and pushed it to the end of our tasks array. So we don't need that label text anymore. It's already been added to our array. Now we can just clear this label input value. So let's save and refresh and try that again. Adding a task, click this button, and boom, the input has been cleared. Now, I can't just start typing again because there's something in web pages called focus. And you'll see it when I click on this text box, it outlines in blue. That means this input is focused. It has a keyboard focus. So when I type, the letters I'm typing go into that input. If I click outside of that input and type, letters don't go into it because that input isn't focused. And anytime I click another element on screen, or say this button on screen, this input, you can see, it loses its focus. It loses that blue outline. So in addition to clearing the value, what I want to happen is every time I click this button, I want the focus to go back to that input. So down here in our function, we can continue to add functionality here. I want to take that label input variable, which we've set equal to this new task label, which is that input tag, and we want to focus it on the page. So at the very end of this function, I'm going to say label input dot, and there is a function on label input, all inputs, called focus. So I'm going to call this function with the parentheses, and that will focus that input. So let's save, refresh, and once again, we'll add a task, click. It has cleared the value and focused that input. Now it's ready for me to keep typing. So add another task, click. It cleared the input and it refocused it for another new task. That's a nice user experience, and it will save our users a few clicks along the way. One more bit of polish we can add is sometimes the user might accidentally click this button and they haven't added anything to the text field. We don't want blank items to show up in our list. So we need to add kind of a guard. We need to add a guard or a condition. If this input is blank, then let's not do anything. So how can we do that? We can do that by adding what's called an if statement or an if condition. Let me show you how if conditions work. What we want to happen is when we extract the text here for this label, we want to check if it is equal to nothing or an empty string, an empty amount of text. So before we push this new task onto the array, let's add a condition that will allow us to check first if it's empty and only add it to the array if it is not empty. So above this line here, let's add an if condition. So an if condition just starts with an if. Then we have a space and an open parentheses. Inside this parentheses is where we put our condition. And in this case, what we want our condition to be is if the label text is not empty, then add that new label text to the array and re-render the screen. So we will say if the label text is not an empty string. In JavaScript, there are conditional operators, equals and not equals. If we wanted to check if label text is equal to an empty string, that would be 3 equal signs and an empty string. So this statement would read, if label text is equal to empty, then we could do something. In our case, we want to check if it's not empty. And if and only then, we want to add it to the list. So 3 equal signs is checking to see if this is equal, and an exclamation mark followed by 2 equal signs is checking if it's not equal. If it's not equal to an empty string, then we want to push it to tasks and re-render. Since we're doing multiple things here, kind of like in a function, we can use curly braces to allow us to do multiple lines. So I'm going to add an opening curly brace here. I'm going to tab over these lines here just to indicate that they're a part of it. Tabs in JavaScript actually don't mean anything. They're really there for visual value. So I have my open curly braces and my closed curly braces here. So if the label text is not empty, then push that label text to tasks, re-render the screen, and no matter what this condition is, it will continue on outside of the curly braces. So whether label text is empty or not, these items will be run since they are outside of the curly braces. And in our case, we do want to focus the input every time. So even if it's empty, once we click on the button, it loses focus. So we do want to refocus it every time. We don't necessarily need to reset this to empty because it is empty if this isn't true. So I'm going to move this line up inside of our if condition here, just because we don't need it outside of it. So let me save this and refresh. Now let's try to click this button and nothing happens. In fact, actually something happens. It refocuses the field automatically for us because this is outside the if condition. That's good, but nothing gets added to the list. Let's make sure we can still add things to the list. So can we still add? And yes, we can, but we cannot add empty items to the list. So that is your first taste of adding an interactive experience to the page. We've added a text input and a button to the page to collect user-generated content. We've added an on-click handler or an on-click function to this button to run some code every time a user enters text. And we've learned how to re-render our list once our tasks array has new content in it. That was a lot of fun. Now we still have a little ways to go in order to get to our final end goal. If you remember, our final end goal is this. It's to create this to-do list app that has this list screen with all of our tasks and this focus screen which allows us to focus on one task at a time. We actually do now have at least the functionality, maybe not the looks, at least the functionality for listing tasks out and even adding tasks down below. In the next episode, we'll add the functionality for adding this focus screen and the ability to switch between our list and focus views. I'll see you there.